In the annals of World War II, where tales of courage and cunning often blur into legend, the story of Krystyna Skarbek stands apart as a testament to the extraordinary power of nerve, intelligence, and sheer audacity in the face of absolute terror. Born Krystyna Janina Skarbek on May 1, 1908, in Warsaw, Poland, to a Polish aristocrat father and a Jewish mother, she grew up in a world of privilege that would soon crumble beneath the weight of global conflict. Her father taught her to ride horses like a cavalry officer, to ski through the Tatra Mountains with the grace of a phantom, and to embrace the wildness of nature with a fearlessness that would define her destiny. By her early 20s, she had already carved a reputation as a striking beauty with an adventurous spirit, winning a beauty contest in 1930 and later marrying a wealthy businessman, though neither marriage nor comfort could contain her restless soul. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Krystyna was skiing in the Tatra Mountains, and she immediately made her way to Warsaw, where she approached British intelligence with a proposal so bold it seemed almost reckless. She would ski across the Tatra Mountains into Nazi-occupied Poland and establish the first intelligence link between the Polish resistance and the Allies. The British, initially skeptical of this elegant Polish woman with her limited English and boundless confidence, could not have anticipated that they were witnessing the arrival of one of the war's most remarkable operatives. Within weeks of the invasion, Krystyna undertook her first mission, crossing the snow-covered Tatra Mountains on skis with a British journalist named Andrew Kowarski, carrying vital intelligence and propaganda materials into occupied Poland. The journey was treacherous beyond imagination, with temperatures plunging to 20 degrees below zero, Nazi patrols scouring the passes, and the constant threat of avalanches that could bury them without trace. Yet Krystyna moved through this white hell with the certainty of someone who had found her true calling, her knowledge of the terrain, and her physical endurance, allowing her to complete what military experts considered impossible. She made contact with the fledgling Polish resistance, the Związek Łaki's Brojnij, and established the first reliable channel for intelligence to flow from occupied Poland to London, including details of German troop movements, fortifications, and the nascent Holocaust that was already beginning to unfold in the occupied territories. Her reports were not merely military intelligence. They were human documents that conveyed the suffering of a nation, and they earned her the attention of British Special Operations Executive, the organization Winston Churchill had ordered to set Europe ablaze through sabotage, subversion, and support for resistance movements across the continent, WY 1940. Krystyna had become one of the SOE's most valued assets, though her relationship with the organization was often tempestuous. She rejected the conventional training protocols, arguing that her experience in the field exceeded anything the instructors could teach, and she was frequently at odds with the bureaucratic nature of military intelligence. Yet her results were undeniable, and she was dispatched on increasingly dangerous missions throughout occupied Europe, operating under the alias Christine Granville, a name she would carry for the rest of her life, and which would become synonymous with espionage excellence. In Hungary, she established contact with the Polish resistance and helped organize the escape of Polish soldiers who would eventually form the Polish armed forces in the West, while simultaneously gathering intelligence on German preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Her work was not without personal cost. She was arrested by Hungarian police in 1941 and subjected to interrogation that would have broken lesser individuals, but she maintained her cover with such conviction that she was eventually released, though the experience left her with a permanent wariness of capture and a deeper understanding of the thin line between life and death in occupied Europe. The year 1944 found Christine Granville, as she was now known to all but her closest confidants, operating in the most dangerous theater of her career, occupied France, where the Gestapo had established a reign of terror that made every resistance operation a dance with death. She was attached to the Jockey Network, one of the most active SOE circuits in southern France, and her mission was to coordinate with the French Maquis in preparation for the Allied invasion of Normandy. The Maquis were desperate for arms, supplies, and leadership, and Christine moved among them with the authority of a field commander, organizing drops of weapons and explosives, planning sabotage operations against German rail lines and communications, and providing the crucial link between London and the resistance fighters on the ground. Her presence was electric. She inspired loyalty through her courage, often refusing to take cover during German raids while her comrades sought shelter, and her ability to speak multiple languages, Polish, French, English, German, made her invaluable in the complex political landscape of the French resistance, where rival factions often threatened to tear the movement apart from within. But it was in the summer of 1944, as the Allied invasion of Normandy was underway and the Gestapo intensified their efforts to crush the resistance before the Allies could break out of their beachhead, that Christine Granville would perform the act that would elevate her from remarkable operative to legend. The Gestapo had captured several key members of the jockey network, including Francis Kammertz, the circuit's leader and Christine's closest ally, along with two other agents, Zen Fielding and Christian Sorensen. They were imprisoned in the Gestapo headquarters in Digne-les-Bains, sentenced to death, with their execution scheduled for the following morning. The situation seemed hopeless. The Gestapo commander, Albert Schenk, was a hardened Nazi official known for his ruthlessness, and the prison was heavily guarded. Conventional rescue attempts were impossible, and London could offer no assistance in the time available. It was then that Christine Granville made a decision that would save 3 lives and demonstrate the extraordinary potential of psychological warfare. She would walk into the Gestapo headquarters alone and bluff the commander into releasing his prisoners. The audacity of this plan cannot be overstated. Christine had no military force backing her, no weapons, no official authority beyond her forged papers identifying her as a British agent with the power to negotiate. What she possessed was an intimate understanding of the German psychology of defeat, the ability to read her opponent, and a nerve that seemed to transcend human fear. She spent hours preparing her approach, studying what she knew of Schenk, analyzing the situation in France as the Allied advance continued, and crafting a narrative so compelling that it might override the Gestapo officer's duty to his superiors. She would convince him that the war was lost, that the Allies were approaching Digne-les-Bains at that very moment, and that his only hope for survival lay in releasing the prisoners and positioning himself as a collaborator rather than a war criminal. It was a gamble based on the psychology of a regime that was beginning to crumble, and on Christine's ability to project absolute certainty in the face of impossible odds that on the morning of August 13th, 1944, Christine Granville walked into the Gestapo headquarters in Digne-les-Bains dressed in her SOE uniform, her appearance immaculate, her demeanor that of someone accustomed to command. She demanded to see Commander Schenk, and, when brought before him, did not plead or bargain, but instead informed him with cold authority that she was a British agent representing General Montgomery's headquarters, and that she had come to offer him a choice that would determine his fate. The Allied forces, she declared, were hours away from the town, and the local resistance was prepared to rise in insurrection the moment they arrived. If he executed the prisoners, he would be held personally responsible for war crimes and would face summary execution when the Allies took control. If, however, he released them immediately, she would guarantee his safety and provide him with a letter of protection that would identify him as someone who had cooperated with the Allied forces. The lie was magnificent in its construction, supported by forged documents, a detailed knowledge of Allied operations in the region, and Christine's absolute conviction as she delivered it. Schenk was initially incredulous, but Christine's performance was so assured, her details so specific, her certainty so absolute, that doubt began to creep into his calculations. The news from Normandy was indeed dire for Germany. The Allied breakout was underway, and the rapid advance of Patton's Third Army had created panic among German occupation forces across France. Christine played on this fear with the skill of a master psychologist, emphasizing that the war was lost, that the Gestapo's reign of terror was ending, and that individual officers would soon be held accountable for their actions. She spoke of the Allied commitment to prosecuting war criminals, of the lists being compiled, of the noose that awaited those who had committed atrocities against resistance fighters. And then she offered the carrot, a letter of protection signed by her, that would mark him as a collaborator rather than a criminal, a document that might save his life in the chaos of the coming liberation. It was a bluff of breathtaking proportions, for she had no authority to make such promises, no knowledge of Allied timelines, and no guarantee that the resistance would not simply shoot Schenck the moment they had the chance. For hours, the negotiation continued, with Christine maintaining her composure through sheer force of will as the clock ticked toward the scheduled executions. She refused to leave, refused to compromise, and gradually wore down Schenck's resistance through the relentless logic of her argument and the mounting evidence of German defeat. Finally, in a moment that seems almost miraculous in retrospect, Schenck agreed to release the prisoners in exchange for the letter of protection. Christine had brought no money, no weapons, no threats of force beyond the phantom army she had conjured through words alone, yet she had convinced the Gestapo commander to surrender his condemned prisoners. Kammertz, Fielding, and Sorensen were brought from their cells, bewildered by their sudden reprieve, and walked out of Gestapo headquarters into the French afternoon, alive because one woman had dared to believe that the power of a convincing lie could overcome the machinery of terror. The rescue would become one of the most celebrated episodes in SOE history, a testament to the potential of individual courage and psychological warfare in the darkest moments of the conflict. The liberation of Francis Kammertz, Zen Fielding, and Christian Sorensen from Gestapo custody marked the pinnacle of Christine Granville's operational career, but the aftermath of this extraordinary rescue revealed both the personal cost of her service and the complex emotional terrain that she navigated as a woman in the male-dominated world of espionage. Kammertz, who would later become her lover and remain the great love of her life, emerged from prison physically weakened but spiritually unbroken, and their reunion was charged with the intensity of two people who had faced death together and found in each other a kindred spirit forged in the crucible of war. Yet the war was not yet over, and Christine could not rest on her laurels. The Allied advance through France was creating new opportunities for resistance operations, and the SOE needed her skills more than ever to coordinate the final destruction of German occupation forces in the region. She threw herself back into work with characteristic energy, organizing additional sabotage operations, facilitating the surrender of German garrisons, and serving as a liaison between the advancing Allied armies and the French resistance networks she had helped build. The months following the Digne-les-Bains rescue were among the most productive of her career, as she moved through the liberating countryside with the authority of someone who had earned her place through blood and nerve rather than rank or protocol. However, the end of the war in Europe in May 1945 brought not the celebration Christine might have expected, but rather a profound sense of displacement and loss. The SOE, its mission accomplished, was rapidly dismantled, and its agents were demobilized with little ceremony or recognition. For Christine, who had given 6 years of her life to the organization, who had risked everything repeatedly in service of Allied victory, the transition to peace proved extraordinarily difficult. She was awarded the George Cross, the highest civilian decoration for gallantry in the United Kingdom, as well as the French Croix de Guerre and the Polish Cross of Merit with swords, but these honors could not fill the void left by the disappearance of the purpose that had driven her existence. The adrenaline of operations, the clarity of wartime morality, the tight-knit community of fellow agents who understood her without explanation, all of these vanished with the peace, leaving her to navigate a civilian world that seemed trivial and constraining by comparison. She attempted to find work that would utilize her skills, applying for positions in the Foreign Office and various intelligence services, but she was repeatedly rejected, her reputation for independence, and her refusal to conform to bureaucratic expectations counting against her in the rigid hierarchies of post-war British officialdom. The personal toll of her service became increasingly apparent as Christine struggled to adapt to life in London. She had no permanent home, limited financial resources, and a network of relationships that had been built for wartime utility rather than peacetime stability. Her affair with Kammertz had ended, not through any diminution of feeling, but through the practical impossibility of sustaining a relationship when both were struggling to rebuild their lives in different countries and circumstances. She took various jobs that seemed beneath her capabilities: waitressing, sales work, even a brief stint as a stewardess on an ocean liner. Each position a reminder of how little the civilian world valued the skills that had made her invaluable during the war. Her beauty, which had been an asset in operations, became a liability in post-war London, where she was often dismissed as merely a pretty face or, worse, suspected of having achieved her wartime successes through sexual rather than professional means. The rumors that had always circulated about Christine, that she had slept with sources to obtain intelligence, that her relationships with male colleagues were transactional rather than genuine, followed her into peace, amplified by a society eager to diminish the achievements of women who had stepped outside traditional roles. The psychological impact of her wartime experiences also began to manifest in ways that Christine could neither control nor fully understand. She had always been a risk-taker, but in post-war London, her appetite for danger seemed to escalate beyond reason. She took up motorcycle racing, driving at breakneck speeds through city streets with the same disregard for personal safety that had characterized her missions behind enemy lines. She formed attachments quickly and intensely, then moved on just as rapidly, leaving behind a trail of wounded feelings and confused expectations. Her friends from the SOE, those who had survived the war, watched with concern as she seemed to seek out situations that replicated the adrenaline and uncertainty of her operational days, unable or unwilling to accept the mundane rhythms of normal life. There were periods of stability, including a close friendship with another former SOE agent, Andrzej Kowarski, who had been her companion on that first ski mission into Poland and who understood her in ways that others could not. But even this relationship could not anchor her completely. She was, as one biographer would later note, a woman who had been trained to live on the edge and who found the flat terrain of peace psychologically uninhabitable. The final chapter of Christine Granville's life began in June 1952, when she took employment as a stewardess on the ocean liner Ruhin, sailing between London and Australia. The job provided escape from the disappointments of her London existence, the vast distances of ocean travel offering a kind of liminal space where she did not have to confront the gap between her wartime stature and her peacetime obscurity. But even this temporary refuge was denied her when she was dismissed from the position after a dispute with a fellow crew member, leaving her once again without direction or income. She returned to London and took a room at the Shelbourne Hotel in Kensington, a modest establishment that catered to transient visitors and those down on their luck. It was there, in the summer of 1952, that she encountered Dennis Muldowney, a disturbed and obsessive man who had worked as a steward on the Ruhin and who had become fixated on Christine during their brief acquaintance. Muldowney was exactly the kind of damaged, volatile personality that Christine had been trained to identify and manipulate during the war, but in the context of civilian London, her instincts failed her and she did not recognize the danger he represented. The relationship that developed between Christine and Muldowney was brief and, from her perspective, casual, another in the series of intense but temporary connections she had formed since the war. But Muldowney experienced it differently, interpreting her attention as profound love and becoming increasingly possessive and jealous as she attempted to distance herself from him. On June 15, 1952, Christine arranged to meet Muldowney at the Shelbourne Hotel to make clear that their association was over. The confrontation that followed ended with Muldowney stabbing Christine to death in the hotel stairwell, a brutal, senseless murder that extinguished one of the brightest lights of the wartime resistance. She was 44 years old, her death as violent and unexpected as the life she had led. Her body discovered by a hotel maid who could not have known that the woman lying in blood on the stairs had once walked into Gestapo headquarters and convinced the commander to surrender his prisoners. The irony was unbearable. Christine Granville, who had survived Nazi torture chambers, Gestapo interrogations, and countless operations behind enemy lines, had been killed by a disturbed man in a London hotel, victim not of the great conflict she had fought, but of the random violence of peacetime. The murder of Krystyna Skarbek, Christine Granville, was front-page news in Britain, the sensational circumstances ensuring coverage that her wartime heroism had never received. Muldowney was quickly arrested, tried, and hanged for the murder, his execution providing a kind of grim closure, but no real answer to the question of why a woman who had given so much for her adopted country had been left so vulnerable in its aftermath. The press coverage focused on the tragic romance of her death, the beautiful spy killed by a jealous lover, rather than on the extraordinary achievements that had defined her life, and this reduction of her complex existence to a tabloid narrative seemed a final indignity. Her funeral was attended by former SOE colleagues, by Camerads who had remained her friend despite the end of their romance, by the few who understood what she had accomplished, but the broader public soon forgot, and Christine Granville became one of those figures whose wartime significance was buried beneath the accumulating weight of history. It would be decades before historians and biographers would excavate her story, revealing the full scope of her contributions and the injustice of her post-war treatment. But by then the woman herself was long dead, her ashes scattered according to her wishes, her physical presence erased from the world she had helped save. The historical rehabilitation of Krystyna Skarbek began in earnest during the 1970s and 1980s, as the classification of SOE files gradually lifted and historians gained access to the documentary record of her extraordinary service. What emerged from these archives was a portrait far more complex and impressive than the sensationalized accounts of her death had suggested, revealing an operative whose contributions extended far beyond the famous Digne-les-Bains rescue to encompass virtually every theater of SOE operations in Europe. The documents showed that Christine Granville had undertaken missions in Poland, Hungary, France, and Egypt, had been involved in intelligence work that directly influenced Allied strategy, and had maintained operational effectiveness longer than almost any other female agent in the organization. Her personnel file, filled with contradictory assessments from superiors who alternately praised her brilliance and complained about her insubordination, painted a picture of a woman who refused to fit into the military hierarchy she served, yet whose results consistently justified the difficulties she created. The official histories of the SOE, written by men who had never operated behind enemy lines and who often viewed female agents with patronizing skepticism, had minimized her role, but the raw operational records told a different story, one of sustained courage and exceptional capability in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. The Polish dimension of Skarbek's service proved particularly significant as historians reconstructed the early years of the war, when her work establishing communication channels between occupied Poland and the Allied governments had provided crucial intelligence at a time when few other sources existed. The documents revealed that her ski missions across the Tatra Mountains had not been isolated adventures, but part of a systematic effort to maintain contact with the Polish resistance during the period when Poland was sealed off from the world by Nazi and Soviet occupation. She had carried not only intelligence, but also propaganda materials, money for resistance operations, and personal messages that maintained the morale of a conquered nation. Her work in Hungary, where she operated under diplomatic cover while officially working for the Polish government in exile, had involved complex political maneuvering as she navigated the competing interests of Polish, British, Hungarian, and eventually German authorities in a country that was technically neutral but increasingly aligned with the Axis. The Hungarian period had ended with her arrest and imprisonment, an experience that she rarely discussed afterward, but that had clearly marked her, teaching her lessons about vulnerability and survival that would inform her later operations. The French period of Christine Granville's service, which had produced the Digne-les-Bains rescue, was revealed through the archives to have been even more extensive than initially reported. She had parachuted into France multiple times, had organized and supplied several Maquis units, had participated in direct combat operations against German forces, and had established a reputation among the resistance fighters that bordered on reverence. The French records compiled by the organization she had supported showed that she had been responsible for the delivery of tons of weapons and explosives, the organization of hundreds of resistance fighters, and the coordination of countless sabotage operations that had disrupted German supply lines and communications in the crucial months before and after D-Day. Her ability to move between different resistance networks, mediating disputes and forging alliances between groups that often viewed each other with suspicion or hostility, had been as valuable as her more dramatic exploits, and had contributed significantly to the unified front that emerged in southern France during the Liberation. The French historians who examined these records were struck by the contrast between Christine's operational significance and the limited recognition she had received, a pattern that reflected both the destruction of SOE records designed to protect agents and the broader tendency of military history to marginalize contributions that did not fit conventional narratives of heroism. The personal documents that became available, including letters to friends and family, revealed the emotional cost of Christine's service in ways that official reports could not capture. She wrote of her fear before missions not with the bravado of adventure stories, but with the honest terror of someone who understood exactly what capture would mean, who had seen the results of Gestapo interrogation and knew that her gender offered no protection from the most brutal treatment. She wrote of her love for Francis Cammertz with a passion that transcended the operational partnership that had brought them together, describing him as the only person who truly understood the person she had become through war. And she wrote of her identity, the confusion of being Krystyna Skarbek, Polish patriot, Christine Granville, British agent, and the various other aliases she had assumed, until she sometimes felt that the original self had been lost somewhere in the snows of the Tatra Mountains or the interrogation rooms of Budapest. These letters, read alongside the operational records, created a portrait of a woman who had paid a profound psychological price for her service, who had given not merely her time and her courage, but something essential of her selfhood to the cause she served. The historiographical reassessment of Christine Granville's career coincided with broader movements in the study of women's history and the history of resistance movements, which created new frameworks for understanding contributions that had previously been dismissed or marginalized. Feminist historians were particularly interested in her case, seeing in her story both the possibilities and the limitations that confronted women who sought to participate fully in military operations during the mid-20th century. Christine had succeeded in large measure because she refused to accept the constraints that military bureaucracy sought to impose, creating space for herself through sheer competence and force of personality. But this same independence had ultimately contributed to her difficulties in the post-war period, when the return to conventional gender roles left no place for her particular combination of skills and experience. The contrast between her wartime authority and her post-war marginalization became a case study in the larger patterns of women's history, illustrating how the disruptions of war could create temporary openings for female agency that were rapidly closed when peace restored traditional hierarchies. This analytical framework, while sometimes reducing Christine's individual story to a representative example of broader trends, also helped to explain the specific circumstances of her post-war difficulties and the failure of British society to properly value her contributions. The recovery of Christine Granville's story also involved the correction of numerous myths and misconceptions that had grown up around her figure, many of them originating in the sensationalized accounts of her death and the spy fiction that had used her as inspiration. The most persistent of these myths concerned her sexuality, the assumption that her operational successes must have been achieved through sexual manipulation rather than professional skill. The archival record provided no support for this assumption. While Christine was undoubtedly attractive and used her appearance as one tool among many in her operational repertoire, there was no evidence that she engaged in sexual relationships as a systematic intelligence technique. The rumors that circulated during and after the war said more about the inability of her contemporaries to imagine a woman succeeding in dangerous operations through courage and intelligence alone than they did about her actual methods. Similarly, the myth of her as a femme fatale, a dangerous seductress who left a trail of broken hearts and compromised missions, was revealed as a projection of male anxiety onto a woman whose actual relationships were characterized by loyalty and genuine affection, even when they were temporary or unconventional. The historical Christine Granville was far more interesting than these fictionalized versions. a professional intelligence officer of exceptional ability who happened to be a woman in a male-dominated field, rather than a woman who used her gender as a primary operational tool. The transformation of Christine Granville from historical footnote to recognized figure of World War II resistance was significantly advanced by the publication of several biographies that sought to place her story in proper context, beginning with Madeleine Misson's 1975 biography Christine, A Search for Christine Granville, and continuing through more recent scholarly works that have utilized newly available archival materials. Misson's book, written with the cooperation of surviving SOE colleagues and friends, was particularly important in establishing the factual basis for Christine's story and correcting the sensationalized accounts that had dominated public understanding. The biography revealed the extent of Misson's own research challenges, as SOE files remained partially classified and many participants were reluctant to discuss operations that had been conducted under vows of secrecy. Yet Misson persisted, tracking down former agents, resistance fighters, and family members, piecing together a narrative that demonstrated both the extraordinary scope of Christine's service and the tragic inadequacy of the recognition she had received. The book's publication generated significant interest, leading to documentary films, newspaper features, and the gradual incorporation of Christine's story into broader histories of the SOE and the European resistance. The subsequent biographical and historical work built upon Misson's foundation, while benefiting from the progressive declassification of government records and the changing cultural climate that made women's contributions to military operations more readily acknowledged. Claire Muley's 2012 biography, The Spy Who Loved, The Secrets and Lives of Christine Granville, represented a significant advance in scholarly rigor, utilizing previously unavailable Polish and British archives to reconstruct Christine's early life and the full complexity of her service. Muley's work was particularly valuable in its treatment of Christine's Polish identity, exploring how her status as an exile from a country that had been betrayed by its allies at Yalta influenced her post-war experiences and her sense of displacement. The biography also provided the most detailed account yet of Christine's psychological state in the final years of her life, drawing on medical records and interviews with those who knew her to paint a portrait of a woman suffering from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, unable to find stability in a world that had no use for the skills she had developed and the person she had become through war. This clinical framing, while necessarily speculative given the limitations of historical evidence, offered a more compassionate and nuanced understanding of Christine's difficulties than previous accounts that had emphasized personal failings or character flaws. The enduring legacy of Krystyna Skarbek, Christine Granville, extends far beyond the biographies and memorials that have sought to preserve her memory, reaching into the ongoing evolution of military organizations and the changing understanding of what courage and capability look like in the context of war and national service. The integration of women into special operations forces, a process that has accelerated in the 21st century with the opening of combat roles to female personnel in many Western militaries, can be traced in part to the examples set by Christine and her SOE colleagues, who demonstrated that gender was no barrier to effectiveness in the most demanding operational environments. Contemporary special operations training programs study the SOE experience, including Christine's methods, for lessons about adaptability, improvisation, and the psychological dimensions of irregular warfare that remain relevant despite the technological transformations of modern conflict. The principles she employed, building trust across cultural boundaries, maintaining operational security through personal discipline, using deception and psychological manipulation to overcome material inferiority, are taught in military schools as timeless elements of special operations tradecraft, divorced from the specific historical circumstances of occupied France, but rooted in the examples of practitioners like Christine who proved their effectiveness under the most extreme conditions. The intelligence community's ongoing engagement with Christine's story reflects broader debates about the nature of human intelligence operations in an age of technological surveillance and cyber warfare. As signals intelligence and satellite reconnaissance have reduced the relative importance of human agents in some contexts, The unique capabilities that Christine represented, the ability to build relationships, to read human psychology, to operate in denied environments with minimal technological support, have been revalued for situations where machines cannot go and algorithms cannot penetrate. The recruitment and training of human intelligence officers now emphasizes the interpersonal skills that Christine possessed intuitively, the capacity to establish rapport across lines of difference, and to sustain cover stories through sheer force of personality. Her example has been particularly influential in the development of programs for female intelligence officers, who continue to face some of the same stereotypes and skepticism that Christine encountered, and who find in her story a precedent for success that does not require conforming to masculine models of operational behavior. The Christine Granville who walked into Gestapo headquarters and convinced the commander to surrender his prisoners through the power of her conviction represents a model of intelligence effectiveness that complements rather than replaces the more conventional approaches, expanding the repertoire of available methods rather than competing with them. The ethical dimensions of Christine's service continue to generate debate among historians, philosophers, and military professionals, particularly as contemporary conflicts raise similar questions about the boundaries of acceptable conduct in warfare. The lie she told at Digne-les-Bains, the promise of protection she had no authority to make, the psychological manipulation of a man who was himself complicit in atrocity. These actions can be evaluated through various ethical frameworks. From the consequentialist perspective that justifies any means necessary to defeat Nazism, to the deontological insistence on absolute moral principles regardless of circumstance. Christine herself seems to have operated without evident moral anguish, accepting the necessities of her role with the pragmatic fatalism that characterized her generation's response to the unprecedented challenges of total war. But the questions her actions raise remain relevant. Does the existence of a genuinely evil opponent justify any deception in response? What are the long-term consequences for trust and international order when intelligence operatives make promises they cannot keep? How do we evaluate the psychological costs of operational lying on those who practice it? The erosion of the boundary between performance and authenticity that Christine herself seems to have experienced. These are not questions with definitive answers, but the ongoing engagement with them, using Christine's example as a case study, ensures that her story remains intellectually vital rather than merely historically interesting. The personal tragedy of Christine's final years, her inability to find a place in the post-war world she had helped create, has resonated with subsequent generations of veterans who have experienced similar difficulties transitioning from military to civilian life. The phenomenon of post-traumatic stress, the challenges of finding meaningful employment after specialized military service, the sense of displacement that comes from having lived at intensity levels that civilian life cannot replicate. These experiences, now widely recognized and increasingly addressed through veteran support programs, were poorly understood in Christine's time, leaving her to navigate them without the institutional support that might have made a difference. Her story has been taken up by advocates for improved mental health services for veterans, serving as a historical example of the costs of neglect and the importance of providing comprehensive support for those who have served in demanding operational roles. The contrast between her wartime competence and her post-war vulnerability illustrates the artificiality of the boundary between military and civilian life, the continuity of personhood that means the psychological impact of service does not end when the uniform is removed. In this sense, Christine's story has become part of the larger narrative of veteran experience, her individual tragedy contributing to collective understanding and improved support for those who follow in her footsteps. The international dimensions of Christine's legacy reflect the complex identity she carried throughout her life as Polish patriot, British agent, and European resistance fighter, embodying the transnational solidarities that the war both required and created. In contemporary Europe, where the integration of national histories into broader narratives of European experience remains an ongoing project, Christine's story offers a model of cosmopolitan patriotism, the possibility of serving one's nation while recognizing connections to larger human communities. Her Polish identity, which she never abandoned despite her service to British intelligence and her adoption of a British identity, has made her a significant figure in Polish historical memory, a representative of the Polish contribution to Allied victory that was often minimized in Western historiography. The reconciliation of Polish and British perspectives on her service, the recognition that she served both nations and represented the best of both traditions, mirrors the larger project of European historical reconciliation that has proceeded since the end of the Cold War. Her story is taught in schools in both countries, part of the shared heritage that binds Poland and Britain across the distance of geography and the complications of contemporary politics. The final measure of Christine Granville's significance lies not in the monuments that bear her name or the books that recount her exploits, but in the intangible influence she exercises on those who encounter her story and find in it inspiration for their own lives. The young women who learn of her example and recognize possibilities for themselves that they had not previously imagined. The intelligence officers who study her methods and incorporate her insights into their own practice. The historians who use her experience to illuminate larger patterns of war and society. The ordinary citizens who are reminded by her story of the capacity for courage that exists within apparently unremarkable individuals. These are the true legacy of her remarkable life. The Christine Granville who skied across the Tatra Mountains in the winter of 1939, who faced Gestapo interrogation in Budapest, who walked into the headquarters of terror in Digne-les-Bains and emerged with 3 lives saved, represents something essential about the human capacity for resistance against oppression. The refusal to accept the inevitability of evil. The belief that individual action can alter the course of events even in the darkest hours. This belief, which she embodied more fully than most, remains necessary in every age, and her story continues to communicate it with an immediacy that transcends the specific historical circumstances of its origin. Krystyna Skarbek, Christine Granville, died violently and too young in a London hotel stairwell, but the meaning of her life continues to unfold, revealing new dimensions as each generation encounters her example and finds in it resources for their own struggles against the various forms of darkness that persist in human affairs.